King Solomon warned about a pattern that destroys relationships, wealth, and leadership while looking perfectly fair. 50-50. It sounds balanced. It feels just. It looks like equality. But hidden inside that symmetry is a flaw so subtle that you don't notice it breaking things until it's already too late. Solomon saw this long before modern systems, long before contracts, long before partnerships built on equal control. He watched alliances fail, households fracture, leaders lose kingdoms, not because of obvious mistakes, but because of invisible tension created by divided authority. Because when everything is equal, nothing is stable. Think about it carefully. If two people hold exactly the same weight of decision, who leads when pressure hits? Who sacrifices when something has to give? Who carries the burden when the outcome is uncertain? No one. And that's where the crack begins. What looks like fairness becomes paralysis. What feels like balance becomes conflict waiting for the right moment to surface. And what was meant to protect the relationship slowly starts to suffocate it. Solomon never warned against sharing. He warned against structures that remove responsibility. Because when responsibility is split perfectly in half, accountability disappears into the gap. And here's the part most people miss. The danger doesn't show up immediately. It grows quietly. In a business, it becomes hesitation. In a marriage, it becomes resentment. In money decisions, it becomes stagnation. In leadership, it becomes silent power struggles no one names. Everything still looks equal from the outside, but inside, something is slowly decaying. That's why this is so dangerous. You don't feel it when it starts. You feel it when it's already broken. And the real question is not whether 50-50ths is fair. It's why the wisest man in history saw it as a hidden risk, long before anyone else had the language to explain it. Because once you see what he saw, and once you understand why, you'll start seeing quiet collapse everywhere. What makes this so dangerous is not the division itself. It's what that division creates in the unseen space between two people. Because the moment everything becomes 50-50, you don't create balance. You create a tie. And a tie is not neutral. A tie is tension waiting for direction. At first, it feels harmless. Decisions are small, stakes are low, and both sides still carry goodwill. You agree easily, you move forward, and the illusion holds. It feels like maturity, like fairness, like respect. But then something shifts. A decision comes where both perspectives don't align. Not a small one. Something that actually matters. Something that affects money, direction, timing, risk. And suddenly, the structure reveals itself. No one has the final word. No one carries the weight of resolution. So what happens? You don't move. Or worse, you push. Because when there is no defined authority, the human instinct fills the gap. Ego steps in. Not loudly at first, but subtly. Each person begins to defend their position a little more, not because they're trying to dominate, but because they feel the need to protect their voice. And now, what was once cooperation becomes negotiation. Then negotiation becomes resistance, and resistance becomes friction. This is the invisible logic of 50-50. It doesn't remove conflict, it postpones it. It delays the moment where structure is tested, but when that moment finally arrives, there is no mechanism to resolve it cleanly. Only pressure, only emotional leverage, only persuasion, fatigue, or silent compromise. And here's where it becomes even more subtle. Because sometimes one side starts giving in more than the other. Not officially, not declared, but quietly. To avoid tension. To keep peace. To move things forward. And from the outside, everything still looks equal. But internally, imbalance has already begun. One leads without acknowledgement. The other yields without recognition. And over time, That creates something far more dangerous than disagreement. It creates unspoken resentment. Because equality of power does not eliminate hierarchy. It hides it. It forces it to emerge in unhealthy ways instead of structured ones. And this is why what seems like the most peaceful arrangement often becomes the most emotionally exhausting. Because no one knows where they truly stand. No one knows who decides when it matters. And every important moment becomes a silent battle of influence instead of a clear act of leadership. The problem is never loud in the beginning. It doesn't announce itself. It grows in the pauses, in the hesitations, in the decisions that take longer than they should, in the conversations that feel heavier than they used to, until one day you're no longer dealing with a simple disagreement. You're dealing with accumulated friction that was building all along. And by then, it's no longer about the decision. It's about everything that was never resolved. The moment you pull this out of theory and place it into real life, it stops being an idea. It becomes a memory. Because this isn't just about kings, or ancient wisdom, or old systems. This is about patterns you've already lived through, maybe without ever naming them. Think about a relationship. At the beginning, everything feels equal. Decisions are shared, responsibilities are divided, both voices matter. It feels right, modern, respectful. But then life applies pressure. Money decisions, priorities, sacrifices that need to be made. And suddenly, someone has to decide, but no one truly can. So one person starts pushing a little more. The other starts holding back a little more. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough to feel the shift. And from there, something changes. Not in what you say, in how you feel. Now think about a business partnership. Two founders, same shares, same authority, same vote. It works when things are smooth. Growth is exciting, ideas flow, everything feels aligned. Until it isn't. A risk needs to be taken or avoided. One wants to expand. The other wants to protect. One sees opportunity. The other sees danger. And now, there's no final call, so the business slows down. Or fractures, because equality didn't create strength. It removed direction. Now take it into family. Parents trying to divide everything equally between children. Equal attention, equal resources, equal inheritance. It sounds loving, but it often ignores reality. Because people are not equal in need, in responsibility, in maturity. And when everything is forced into equality, fairness starts to feel unfair. Resentment doesn't come from inequality alone. It comes from misplaced equality, and maybe the hardest one to admit. Friendships, where everything is even. Effort is measured. Support is tracked unconsciously. Who gave more? Who showed up more? Who sacrificed more? At some point, the relationship stops being natural and starts becoming a silent ledger. No one says it out loud, but both feel it, even in work environments. Teams where authority is blurred, where leadership is shared equally without clarity, where everyone has input but no one has responsibility. Meetings get longer, decisions get slower, and accountability disappears into the group. No one fails because no one is truly responsible. And then there's something even deeper. Inheritance. Family businesses. Money passed down. Everything divided equally. Because it feels right. But equal ownership without defined authority often destroys what took generations to build. Because now, every decision requires agreement. Every disagreement becomes personal. And what was once a legacy becomes a battlefield of silent power. If you're honest, you've seen this. Maybe not all of it, but at least one of these. A moment where things didn't break because of something obvious, but because no one could move forward without tension. And that's the part most people never connect. They don't blame the structure. They blame the people. They think it was personality, timing, communication. But underneath all of that, there was a system quietly creating friction from the start. And once you see it, you start recognizing it everywhere. Not as something dramatic, but as something that slowly, quietly, makes everything harder than it should be. And when you look at it through a deeper lens, you start to realize something unsettling. What you've been living isn't new. It's already been mapped. Scripture never celebrates divided authority. It reveals order, not as control, but as protection. Because what you call tension today was already understood as disorder long before you were born. Look at creation itself. Nothing competes. The sea doesn't negotiate with the land. Light doesn't argue with darkness. Everything has a boundary, a role, a defined place where it begins and where it ends. And because of that, everything flows. Now imagine if it didn't. If sea and land shared equal authority over the same space, you wouldn't get harmony. You'd get chaos. And that's the first clue. Order is not about equality. It's about clarity. Now bring that into something more human. A moment that defines everything. Two women standing before King Solomon, both claiming the same child. Equal claim, equal conviction, equal voice. And zero resolution. Because when everything is equal, nothing moves. So Solomon does something no one expects. He doesn't try to balance the situation. He doesn't divide responsibility. He doesn't create a compromise. Because he knows something deeper. Truth cannot be divided without being destroyed. So instead of splitting the child, he reveals the heart. One is willing to let go to preserve life. The other is willing to divide to satisfy ego. And suddenly, the illusion of equality collapses. Because equality was never the solution. Discernment was. A center was needed. Clear authority was needed. Now think about what you've lived. That moment where no one could decide. That tension where both sides were right. That situation where compromise felt like loss instead of progress. What you called communication problems, Scripture would call divided authority. What you called emotional tension, Scripture would call lack of order. And then there's one more pattern. Moses, at a point where everything depended on him, every decision, every conflict, every judgment, the system started to break. Not because he lacked wisdom, but because everything flowed through a single, undefined overload. So, what was the solution? Not equality. Not everyone deciding everything together. Structure. Delegation. Clear lines of responsibility. Some judged smaller matters. Others carried heavier ones. And suddenly, movement returned. Flow returned. Peace returned. Because authority was no longer floating between people. It had direction. This is where everything connects. Not as religion, as pattern. What breaks businesses today? What exhausts relationships? What creates silent resentment? Has already been seen before. And the answer was never to make everything equal. It was to make everything clear. Because the moment authority becomes shared without definition, people don't become closer. They become trapped inside unresolved tension. They were never meant to carry. And that's why something that feels so right, so fair, so modern, quietly creates the exact thing it was trying to avoid. Because when authority is clear, things move. But when authority is divided without wisdom, everything begins to decay in silence. Now bring this down from principles into moments you can actually feel. Not big collapses, small, ordinary scenes, where nothing pares errado, but something dentro comica pesser. Imagine a couple in the kitchen. It's late. They're deciding something simple. Maybe finances for the next month. Maybe a change. Maybe a purchase. Both have the same weight in the decision. Both defend their view calmly at first, then silence. Not agreement. Pause. because no one can move forward without the other giving in, and no one wants to be the one who always gives in. So they sit there, not arguing, just stuck. And what should have taken 5 minutes stretches into tension you can almost touch. Now shift to a business. 2 partners, same authority, same vote. A decision needs to be made fast. Opportunity is passing. One feels it, the other hesitates. They talk, they explain, they go in circles. No one is wrong, but nothing moves. And the worst part is not the disagreement. It's the feeling that time is slipping away while both are trying to be fair, but ineffective. Now something even quieter, a friendship. At first, everything flows naturally, but over time, something subtle appears. One starts noticing how often they initiate contact, how often they're the one showing up, helping, adjusting. They don't say anything. They just start counting, not consciously, emotionally. And now every small act carries weight. I did this. Did they do the same? It's no longer connection. It's comparison. And the friendship doesn't explode. It slowly loses warmth. Now take it into family. Siblings dealing with responsibility, caring for parents, managing things together. Everything is divided equally. On paper, it looks perfect. But in reality, one does a little more. Another avoids a little more. One sacrifices quietly. The other assumes it's all balanced. No one speaks directly, but the feeling grows. I'm carrying more. I'm giving more. I'm the one holding this together. And that thought, once it settles, never fully leaves. Now work environment. A team where everyone has equal say. Meetings become long. Decisions become diluted. No one wants to impose. No one wants to dominate. So everything gets filtered through endless discussion. Until eventually, someone informally takes control. Not officially, not acknowledged, but it happens. Because nature rejects vacuum. And now there's an invisible leader. And visible equality, which creates something even more exhausting. Unspoken hierarchy. And finally, the most subtle one of all. Inside your own mind, you start measuring your effort. You compare what you give to what you receive. In relationships, in work, in life. And the moment that comparison becomes constant, peace disappears. Because instead of living, you're balancing. Instead of flowing, you're calculating. And this is how 50-50 doesn't destroy things loudly. It wears them down. In pauses that last too long. In decisions that never land. In emotions that are never expressed, but always felt. Until one day, you're not dealing with a big problem. You're dealing with accumulated weight. And you can't even point to where it started. Because it didn't start with something obvious. It started with something that looked perfectly fair. And at some point, if you keep looking closely enough, you realize this was never really about money, or decisions, or structure. That was just the surface. Underneath it, there's something far more human. Because the real tension doesn't come from 50-50. It comes from what 50-50 exposes. Ego. Not the loud kind, the subtle one. The one that wants to feel seen, respected, considered. The one that resists being overridden, even when it might be necessary. Control. The need to not feel powerless. The discomfort of knowing that someone else could decide something that affects your life without you having the final say. Insecurity. The quiet fear of being taken advantage of giving more than you receive, of ending up on the losing side of something that was supposed to be fair. Comparison. The constant, silent measurement. Who did more? Who sacrificed more? Who showed up more? Even when no one says it, the mind keeps tracking. Validation. The need to feel that your voice matters equally. Not just in theory, but in outcome. Not just being heard, but being followed, and maybe the deepest one of all, the fear of letting go, because giving someone more authority feels like losing something, even if, in reality, it's the only way to create clarity. This is where everything shifts, because now you start to see that the problem was never the percentage. It was the human response to shared power. 50-50 doesn't create these emotions. It reveals them. It removes the structure that would normally absorb tension and places that tension directly between people. So instead of the system holding the weight, the relationship does. And relationships are not built to carry unresolved power dynamics. They're built for connection, not constant negotiation. That's why something so simple, so fair, becomes so exhausting over time. Because every decision turns into a subtle test. Every disagreement becomes a reflection of identity. Every compromise feels like a small loss, instead of a shared movement forward. And the more aware you become of this, the harder it is to ignore, because now you can feel it when it happens. That slight resistance when you have to give in. That tension when no one wants to step back. That quiet discomfort when something is technically equal, but emotionally heavy. And once you see that, you can't pretend it's just about structure anymore. It's about nature. Human nature. And human nature doesn't resolve tension through symmetry. It resolves through clarity. And this is where everything begins to fall apart, in the best possible way, because now you can finally see it. Not everything that looks fair is wise. Not everything that feels balanced is stable, and not everything that is equal actually sustains anything. We've been taught to chase symmetry, to divide things perfectly, to believe that fairness lives in identical portions. But wisdom was never built on symmetry. It was built on structure, on knowing that for something to function, roles must be clear, weight must be carried, and decisions must have a place to land. Because without that, even the strongest relationships begin to strain, not because people are bad, but because the structure forces them into tension. And once you understand this, something shifts inside you. You stop asking, is this equal? And you start asking, is this sustainable? You stop trying to split everything evenly. And you start looking for alignment, for clarity, for responsibility that actually fits reality. So now the question becomes personal, not theoretical. Where in your life does everything look fair, but feel heavy? Where are decisions taking longer than they should? Where are you silently measuring effort? Where are you holding tension that no one talks about, but everyone feels? Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's a partnership. Maybe it's something you've been calling balanced, but deep down, it's just unresolved. And the moment you're honest about that, you're already stepping out of the illusion. Because wisdom doesn't begin when everything is equal. It begins when everything is clear, when responsibility is defined, when someone carries what must be carried, not out of dominance, but out of order. And that's the line most people never cross. They try to protect peace by dividing everything evenly. But real peace was never built on equal division. It was built on rightful alignment. And if there's one truth that echoes through everything Solomon understood, it's this: clarity preserves what equality alone cannot. And the moment you choose clarity over comfort, everything begins to change.